police officer drunk on his own power. With a smug grin, he swings his baton with the old man. But what happens next is nothing short of unbelievable. Seconds later, the officer realized he had messed with the wrong person. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Sierra Vista Park, filtering through the thick canopy of oak and sycamore trees amid the weekend crowd. One man remained apart from the rest. He occupied a wed wooden bench beneath the shade of a towering sycamore. His posture, easy one-booted, foot resting over the other, a small bag of bird seed rested in his lap, and with practiced ease has scattered handfuls onto the ground. The pigeons responded eagerly, flapping their wings, pecking at the kernels, as he observed them in thoughtful silence. His hands, callous rough from years of labor, moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if feeding the birds was less an act of kindness and more a habit long ingrained. He wore faded denim, a simple brown shirt, and a leather belt with a silver buckle, dulled by time. A well-worn cowboy hat shielded his face from the sun, its brim casting a shadow over the rugged, time-worn features beneath his neatly trimmed beard. Streaked with gray, framed a face that bore the weight of experience, a man who had seen much, done much, and carried it all without a word. Chuck Norris sat unmoving, undisturbed by the constant thrum of the city around him. For a man who had spent his life in motion training, fighting, teaching, defending, stillness was an unfamiliar companion. Yet here in the quiet of the park, he found himself simply existing, content in the absence of urgency. No fights to win, no enemies to chase, just an old man with a handful of birdseed. And for now, that was enough. Then came the sound, heavy boots striking pavement, their deliberate cadence slicing through the park's peaceful hum. The footfalls carried a weight that demanded attention, a presence that refused to go unnoticed. The sound grew closer until its owner emerged into view. Officer Callum Reed strode forward with the controlled precision of a man who expected the world to make way for him. His LAPD uniform was crisp, the deep navy fabric stretched over broad shoulders, each detail. Immaculate mirrored sunglasses shielded, his eyes reflecting the park in cold, impersonal fragments. His utility belt was a study in order, baton cuffs, radio taser service weapon, all polished, all placed with meticulous care. Everything about him was measured, rigid, exuding a kind of authority that left no room for negotiation. But those who knew him, those who had crossed his path before, understood that Callum Reed was not simply a man of the law. He was a man who relished power, not for justice, not for duty, but for control. He was not known for his patience, not for his mercy. The people in this neighborhood had long since learned that defying him meant trouble, and most had made it their habit to stay out of his way as he surveyed the park. His gaze swept over the joggers, the families, the couples walking their dogs, then his attention locked onto the lone man on the bench. Something about him was off, too still, too composed. He wasn't a jogger catching his breath, nor a father keeping watch over his child. He simply sat there, unmoving, watching the birds. Reed's lip curled slightly. In distaste, he'd seen men like this before, old stubborn relics who acted as if the world owed them space. They were the kind of people who disregarded rule, convinced that the limits imposed on others simply didn't apply. To them, to him, there was no justifiable reason for someone to sit alone in a public park for this long. If a person wasn't jogging, working, or contributing something tangible to society, then they were merely occupying space without purpose, without a second thought. He veered off the paved walkway and strode toward the bench, his boots striking the ground with deliberate force as he closed the distance. His fingers twitched once, brushing against the baton at his hip, a solid, familiar weight. This wouldn't take much effort, a few firm words, a show of authority, and the old man would be his way. A few onlookers took notice. A woman with a golden retriever on a leash slowed her pace, her gaze flickering between the officer and the man on the bench. Not far off, a group of young men lounged around a picnic table exchanging glances, recognizing the early signs of an impending confrontation. They had seen Officer Reed in action before they knew what happened when someone didn't fall in line quickly enough. Reed came to a saint in front of the bench, his shadow stretching over Chuck like a dark omen. His stance was wide, his hands resting on his belt, radiating the kind of authority that demanded acknowledgement. Yet Chuck remained still. The birds continued pecking at scattered seeds, undisturbed by the officer looming over them. The wind stirred the leaves above, carrying the scent of sun-warmed pavement and freshly cut grass. Reed exhaled sharply through his nose, irritation already prickling beneath his skin. This was the moment when most people glanced up, read the situation and responded accordingly, but the old man didn't even twitch, as if he were completely oblivious to Reed's presence that wasn't going to fly, shifting his weight. The officer cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. But Chuck Norris did not react. He neither acknowledged the words nor spared the officer. So much as a glance, his hands remained steady, releasing another handful of bird seed onto the pavement. The pigeons fluttered, and coeditally indifferent to the rising tension, a flicker of something unfamiliar passed through Reed's mind. Not quite confusion, not quite hesitation, something else. Something he couldn't quite name for the first time in a long while. His mere presence wasn't enough. He wasn't accustomed to that. And he didn't like it. Taking a step forward, he planted his boot inches from Chuck's shoe, his fingers unconsciously shifting toward his baton. He had no patience for defiance, especially not from an old man who thought he could sit there and ignore the law. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the pavement, and still Chuck Norris remained unmoving. The energy in the park had shifted, though most people enjoying the afternoon remained blissfully unaware. The distant laughter of children and the rhythmic footfalls of joggers continued, as before, the hum of the city murmuring beyond the trees, yet in the small pocket of space surrounding the bench. The air had thickened, charged like the moments before a storm. Officer Callum Reed loomed over Chuck Norris, his presence carrying an unspoken demand. His boots gleam, met in the fading sunlight, his stance rigid with expectation. He had given the order, and he expected obedience. That was how this worked. But Chuck did not move. The old man remained as he was, unwavering, his fingers releasing another handful of bird seed onto the ground. The pigeons did not scatter. The bench beneath him did not creak with the weight of movement. If Reed had heard the old man speak, he gave no sign of it. The silence was more infuriating than any words could have been. People didn't ignore him, certainly not when he was in uniform, standing with his feet planted and his presence unmistakable. He was the one who commanded and others obeyed. That was the natural order of things. Yet here in the middle of a public park, an old man sat on a bench as if the badge pinned to Reed's chest carried no weight at all. Reed's fingers tensed at his sides. He had dealt with difficult people before, belligerent drunks, cocky teenagers, protesters who thought defiance made them righteous. But this was different. There was something unsettling in the way this man remained still, not as an act of rebellion, but as if the officer simply wasn't worth acknowledging. A flicker of unease surfaced in Reed's mind, but he shoved it down. Words had their limits, actions did not. With a sharp motion, he swung his baton down against the wooden bench just inches from Chuck's leg. The crack of impact split the air, sending a few startled birds flapping into the sky. Nearby park goers glanced over, their interest fleeting before they turned back to their strolls and conversations. Chuck, however, did not so much as flinch. Reed's patience thinned, his voice rang out sharper this time, laced with the authority he had cultivated over years of unchallenged command. His badge had always been enough. His presence had always been enough, but the old man merely shifted his hat back, the shadow still obscuring most of his face. The movement was slow, deliberate, not the action of a man submitting, no roan seeking to provoke. It was something else entirely. A tightness coiled in Reed's stomach, a sensation he didn't like. He had intended to rattle the manto, remind him who was in control. And yet somehow it was Reed who felt the first stirrings of Yoon. But he wasn't about to back down. With an impatient breath, he raked out fingers closing around Chuck's shoulder, firm and commanding. The muscle beneath his grip was solid, far more so than he had expected from a man who looked old enough to be enjoying retirement then. Before the realization even fully formed, Reed's wrist was caught. The motion wasn't sudden, nor was it violent. It was smooth, precise, effortless, and then the pressure increased just slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to make a point, a jolt of instinctive. Alarm shot through Reed's chest, sharp and immediate. He had encountered resistance before, suspects who bolted, men who lashed out in frantic desperation. But this was something else entirely. This was the grip of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time, Reed felt his certainty waver. Hay yanked his arm back, and to his relief, Chuck let go. His wrist was unscathed, but the sensation lingered, as though the weight of that grip had imprinted itself onto his nerves. Reed took a step back, breath coming quicker than before. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Control had changed hands, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one holding it. He had been the one to start it. The one to take control. Yet in the span of mere seconds, the balance had shifted, and it was he who had pulled back. His jaw tightened. No, he wasn't about to let an old man make him look weak. The baton was still firm in his grip, and he adjusted his stance, fingers clenching tighter around the handle. There would be no warning this time, no restraint this time. The old man would understand, lifting the baton. He aimed straight for the man's shoulder, fully expecting the usual response, flinching, stumbling back, the unspoken acknowledgement of power. But just as their strike came down, Chuck moved. It was nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a subtle shift of weight, a small turn of his body, and it was enough. The baton sliced through empty air, landing nowhere before Reed could react. Chuck's hand was already on his wrist again. There was no struggle, no forceful yank, just a smooth, decisive movement, and in that instant, the baton was no longer his. Reed's pulse pounded. He had trained for this, years of drills, of controlled scenarios, of learning to subdue, to dominate, and yet, in a heartbeat, he had been stripped of his weapon as easily as if he were a child holding a stick. But the old man didn't raise it, didn't threaten. He simply held it, weighing it in his palm, considering it. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he let it fall. The baton hit the ground with a dull clatter. Reed stared at it, his breath uneven, the atmosphere between them shifting in a way he couldn't quite define. The authority he had taken for granted, his uniform, his badge, his weapon had been unraveled, left in pieces at his feet. A few people nearby had started to notice, their murmurs uncertain. A pair of teenagers exchanged whispers, their eyes flickering between Reed and the old man. Others simply watched, hesitant, caught between curiosity and caution. His hands curled into fists, heat rising in his chest, a volatile mix of anger and something far more dangerous, something that felt disturbingly close to fear. He was a man of his word. He was a man of his word. He was a man of his word. His fingers twitched toward his holster, and Chuck Norris was already watching. The baton lay between them, stripped of its power, no longer a symbol of control, but just a useless piece of wood and steel. Officer Callum Reed stood frozen, breath shallow, pulse hammering against his ribs. The crowd had grown, their murmurs drifted through the summer air, gathering weight. Some had stopped mid-step, conversations fading as they took in the scene. Others hung back, drawn to the quiet tension stretching between the two men. But Reed's focus had narrowed to the old man before him, the way he had taken the baton. It had been effortless, almost dismissive, like brushing lint from his sleeve. No aggression, no excess force, and then just as easily he had discarded it, as if to say he had no use for such things, that they were beneath him. Reed's fingers twitched again, his entire body burned with frustration, with an unnamed, goring emotion. He refused to acknowledge it. wasn't just that he had been disarmed, it had unraveled too quickly, slipping from his grasp before he even understood how or why. No, this wasn't something he could allow. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of the park. Instinct took over as his fingers reached for his belt. For the one thing that couldn't be taken from him so easily, his hand found the cool, familiar weight of his service weapon. It was second nature, the ultimate authority, the final say in any confrontation. Yet as his fingers curled around the holster, his movement slowed. A thought, uninvited and sharp as a blade, sliced through the rising tide of his anger. This wasn't some back-alley scuffle. He wasn't staring down a desperate thug looking for trouble. No, this was different. Something was off. Reed had worn the badge for nearly 15 years. He had faced down belligerent drunks, cornered criminals, men with nothing left to lose. He had been in more dangerous situations than he could count, had drawn his weapon more times than he cared to admit. But this was something else. The man standing before him wasn't reacting like people usually did. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his frame, no subtle shift in stance that signaled preparation for a fight. There was only stillness, a quiet, unshakable calm that made the air feel heavier, thick with something inevitable. In his eyes, for the first time Reed really looked at him, they were sharp, unwavering, devoid of arrogance, malice, or even defiance, just patient observation awaiting game, the kind of patience that didn't need to rush because it already knew how this would end. A strange sensation crawled down Reed's spine, something dangerously close to doubt. He'd never felt this before. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, a bead of sweat trailed down the back of his neck. The world around them, park trees, voices blurred into nothing. All that remained was the sun, hot against his skin, the sound of his own breath, and those relentless, watchful eyes. A voice inside him, low and insistent, whispered, "Don't do it." But pride was a dangerous thing. His fingers tightened around the grip once more. In one swift, practiced motion, he pulled the weapon free, and then everything shifted. The old man moved. Later, Reed would struggle to make sense of it. He would replay the moment again and again, trying to fit the pieces together, but it had happened too fast, too seamlessly, like time itself had bent around it. 1 second the gun was in his hand, the next his wrist was caught in an unyielding grip. No pain, no sudden yank, no struggle, just control, precise, effortless, just like before, just like the baton, his weapon. The thing that had always given him the upper hand was slipping from his grasp. And then it was gone. He stood there stunned, fingers still curled around empty air, his body yet to register that he no longer held anything at all. The murmur in the crowd swelled. Someone gasped. A low curse rumbled. From the back of the gathering, the weight of countless eyes settled on him, pressing down heavier than any blow. Chuck Norris turned the gun over in his hand, examining it with an unreadable expression, as if weighing its balance. His face betrayed nothing. Then, with the same measured motion as before, he crouched down, carefully placed the gun beside the baton, and straightened. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Reed swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. The weight of what had just happened settled over him. Like a thick, suffocating fog, he had lost utterly. And he hadn't even seen it coming. His feet felt cemented to the ground, his mind sluggish, struggling to process a reality that didn't align with everything he had trained for. He knew how to fight, had been conditioned to dominate, to restrain, to take control. But this was something else entirely. A deeper, more profound humiliation, and the most infuriating part. The old man hadn't even needed to throw a single punch. Reed's hands curled into fists at his sides, heat creeping up his neck, shame and anger twisting into something almost unbearable in his chest. The crow's murmurs grew, swelling around him, pressing in like a force he couldn't ignore. Then, a flicker of movement. Someone had their phone raised, recording the realization struck with the force of a blow. This wasn't just disgrace, this was proof. Something deep inside him began to unravel, something raw and ugly. Never before had he been in this position, outclassed, outmaneuvered, humiliated, and with an audience to bear witness. And if this video made its way online, no, he refused to let it end like this. His body acted before his mind could stop it, driven by rage, by the sheer desperate instinct to reclaim what had been taken. He lunged, but Chuck Norris had already seen it coming. Time stretched thin the space between them. Weighted with inevitability, Reed moved, but the outcome had already been decided before his muscles had even tensed. There was no calculation in his attack. Only blind, reckless desperation, the instinctive reaction of a man drowning in his own defeat, grasping for control. Where none remained, he lunged his body, twisting forward in a movement that had no precision, no forethought, just the raw need to take back some semblance of power. But desperation was never a match for mastery. And mastery was something Chuck Norris had spent a lifetime refining. Reed never truly saw what happened next. Not in any way that made sense. 1 second he was moving, the next, the entire world shifted. His forward momentum vanished, redirected by something impossibly swift, and controlled his wrist. His own wrist, which had been reaching for the old man just moments before, was suddenly caught, twisted not with pain, not with force, just with a pressure so exact, so effortless, that his body had no choice but to follow his knees, buckled for a fraction of a second. He was weightless. The world tilted, his vision spun, and then just as quickly, it was over. No impact, no crash. Of body against pavement, no pain, no injury, just motion so fluid, so seamless it barely felt real one moment. He was standing the next. He was on his back, staring up at the sky for a long time. He couldn't comprehend what had happened. The voices around him grew louder, creeping into his awareness. He heard them registered. The gasps, the murmured disbelief. But it all felt distant, like sound traveling through water. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as his mind scrambled for explanations that wouldn't come, and then reality crashed in. He had been brought down effortlessly. No wasted movement, no unnecessary force, no fury, no aggression. Just sheer calculated efficiency, and just like that, he had lost the humiliation. Hit first hot and suffocating, a heavy weight sinking into the pit of his stomach. Then came the panic, losing. Control was one thing, but losing it in front of a crowd that was something else entirely. Not just a handful of bystanders, but a growing sea of faces drawn in by the undeniable gravity of the moment. Some held up their phones, their screens flashing. In the afternoon light, this wasn't just embarrassment. This was exposure. His pulse pounded in his skull as he struggled to push himself upright, desperate to regain even a sliver of authority. But before he could move, a shadow fell over him. Chuck Norris stood above him, his expression unreadable. No smirk, no satisfaction, no trace of triumph, just quiet evaluation, as if he was simply waiting to see what Reed would do next. And in that instant, something colder than fear settled deep in Reed's chest. The old man had held back. Not from hesitation, not from luck, but by choice. There had been no real fight, no battle of strength. Chuck had already decided how this confrontation would end before Reed had even reached for his weapon. The weight of that realization crushed him. Reed clenched his jaw as he scrambled to his feet. His body rigid with frustration, he knew better than to strike again. Knew there was no salvaging what had just happened. But pride was a stubborn thing he could feel. The eyes on him, the unspoken judgment in the stillness. He had to act. He had to reassert control. His gaze swept across the park, searching for something, anything to anchor himself to. And then, as if answering some desperate silent plea, he spotted two officers cutting through the crowd. They moved with urgency, hand-shoving near their holsters, their expressions taut with confusion and alertness. They had seen the disturbance from afar and were closing in fast. Relief surged through him. This was his chance, his moment to take command again. With a sharp inhale, he squared his shoulders, forcing steadiness into his stance. Ignoring the way his limbs still trembled, he turned to face them, his jaw locked tight before they could speak, before they could ask questions. He thrust a rigid finger in Chuck Norris's direction. He assaulted an officer. Reed barked, his voice sharp, unwavering. "I want him in cuffs now." The words were his last weapon, his final grasp at authority, his attempt to reshape the narrative before it slipped entirely from his hands for a beat. The officers hesitated. They had seen something, perhaps not everything, but enough to know the situation wasn't as clear-cut as Reed wanted it to be. Their eyes flicked between him and the old man, reading the body language, sensing the unspoken weight of the moment. Then one of them, an older officer with graying temples and weary eyes, froze mid-step. Requiem flickered across his face, but not at Reed. His gaze locked onto the man standing before him, and just like that his entire stance shifted. The stiffness left his shoulders, his posture eased. His fingers hesitated near his holster, the motion slowing before falling away entirely. His eyes, though still sharp with authority, carried something else now, something that almost resembled recognition. He knew exactly who Chuck Norris was. The realization rippled through the other officer as well, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them like a shifting current. Neither man reached for his cuffs, neither drew his weapon. They remained where they stood, locked, in a silent exchange that spoke louder than any command ever could. Reed felt something tighten in his gut. A sickening twist of unease. Control was slipping. No, something more than control. The version of events he had been so determined to construct, the reality he had wanted to force into existence, was unraveling right in front of him. His fingers curled into fists, this sides as his mind scrambled for a way to regain ground. But before he could speak, the senior officer did. "Callum," that was all he said, just the name, nothing more. Yet the weight behind it was enough to stop Reed cold. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick, oppressive, charged with something irreversible in that moment. He understood. He hadn't just lost the argument. He hadn't just lost control of the scene. He had lost something far greater. And as that knowledge settled over him, as the unspoken judgment of his peers closed in like an invisible tide, the last remnants of his confidence fractured. Chuck had never needed to throw a punch. The truth had done all the damage necessary. A hush settled over the park, not the quiet of absence, but of something far heavier. A finality that hung in the air like the last note of a funeral bell. The tension that had once crackled in the space between them had shifted, transforming into something else entirely. Callum Reed stood rigid, his posture locked in the stiff defiance of a man unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. Even as it unfolded inescapably around him, his mind raced, claying for some foothold, some way to know what had already slipped beyond his grasp. But there was no reversing this. The truth was too stark, too absolute. The senior officer took a step forward. He was older than Reed, his features etched with years spent on the job, his hair threaded with gray. Unlike Reed, his uniform was not pressed to inaction, not meticulously maintained for appearance's sake. It bore the soft creases of someone who spent more time working than worrying about the shine of his badge. His gaze moved from Reed to Chuck Norris, then back again, his expression unreadable. Reed's breath came heavy, every inhale laced with frustration, with the bitter taste of something he refused to name. "You need to stop," the senior officer said. His tone was level, quiet, but there was an edge to it. A calm authority, not born from force, but from experience. Reed opened his mouth, the urge to argue clawing at his throat, to justify, to fight back. But there was nothing left to say. No excuse that could withstand the weight of what had just unfolded, and worse, he knew it. The crowd shifted, the murmurs softened, not with doubt, but with the slow, inevitable settling of understanding. They had witnessed everything. They had watched Reed push, watched him try to assert control over a man who had never once raised his voice, let alone his fists, and they had watched him fail somewhere in the crowd. A man muttered something under his breath. A woman nearby gave a small nod. Another held up her phone, still recording. Reed swallowed hard. The senior officer let out a slow breath, his face unreadable yet. There was something in his eyes, something weary, as if he had stood in this exact spot too many times before, watching too many men. Let power turn them reckless. He studied Reed in silence for a long, heavy moment before speaking again. "Give me your badge." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Reed felt his stomach lurch, a sudden heat prickling under his skin. His breath caught somewhere between his ribs. That badge. It wasn't just metal and leather. It was everything, his identity, his purpose. Without it, what was left? His hands twitched at his sides. "This isn't necessary," he said, but the usual edge in his voice was gone. The senior officer's expression remained unchanged. Badge and gun. It wasn't a request. It wasn't up for debate. The finality in those words sent another wave of humiliation burning through Reed's body. His fingers felt heavy, stiff as he reached up to unpin the badge from his chest. For years, it had been his armor, a symbol of authority, a shield against the world. But today, it had failed him, or maybe he had failed it. The metal felt different now, cold, older, heavier, as he placed it into the senior officer's outstretched hand. Then the gun. This was worse. He had already lost it once, today stripped of it like an unruly child, unfit to wield real authority. Now he had to surrender it willingly. The grip was familiar in his palm, the weight one he had carried for years. He hesitated. The senior officer didn't rush him, didn't move, but the message was clear. This wasn't a choice. With slow, deliberate movements, Reed ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the empty weapon atop the badge. The moment it left his hands, something inside him cracked, a silent, irreparable break. The senior officer gave a small nod, as if he had expected no less then. Without another word, he turned to the younger officer beside him. "Escort him out of the park." Reed's jaw tightened. The urge to resist, to fight, to hold on to what was already gone, clawed at him, but there was nothing left. To hold a hand, touched his arm. Not rough, not forceful, just firm. The younger officer, a man Reed had barely noticed before now, stood beside him waiting, so he moved. The walk to the edge of the park was the longest of his life. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself had turned against him. Behind him, voices murmured, eyes followed. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. He kept his head high, even as the weight of disgrace settled into his bones. A once powerful man reduced to nothing by the time he stepped onto the street. The world felt different, as if it had quietly reshaped itself in his absence. The uniform he wore no longer carried the same weight, without the badge, without the gun. It was nothing more than fabric, just another set of clothes draped over a man who had lost everything behind him. The park continued, as if nothing had happened. The moment had passed, the world had moved on, and at the center of it all, Chuck Norris remained exactly where he had been, unchanged, unaffected, a man who had never needed power to prove himself. The crowd, one once uncertain, now looked at him differently. It wasn't just respect, it was recognition for what he was, for what Reed had never been. And as the former officer faded from sight, Chuck saying nothing simply returned to his bench, the pigeons indifferent to the affairs. Ovman fluttered back around him, pecking at the seeds he scattered with the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning. It was over, and as it always had been. Justice had spoken. Wow, what a ride, right? So what do you guys think? What was your biggest takeaway from this? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hey, if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and share for more epic stories like this. Until next time, stay awesome.